a notorious mafia boss, a mysterious maid, and a truth that could destroy both. Cassian Viscari has ruled the underworld for 30 years with blood and fear. No one dared look him in the eye and live to tell the tale. But when Leora Ashcroft walks into his mansion with clean hands and icy eyes, everything begins to tremble. She's no ordinary maid, and he's not the only enemy in this story. Please like and comment the city you're viewing so I know how far my story has progressed. Don't leave, because from this moment on, everything changes. The estate sat 3 miles from the nearest paved road, separated from the rest of the world by a chain-link perimeter lined with motion sensors, 2 staffed guardhouses, and a half-mile stretch of gravel that crunched loud enough to announce any approaching vehicle before it rounded the first curve. The mansion itself was old stone and iron, 4 stories of it, built in the 1940s by a steel baron who'd wanted something that looked like it couldn't be taken. He was right about the architecture. He was wrong about what it would eventually house. Inside, the air carried the faint, persistent smell of gun oil and cold marble and something floral that no one had ever been able to trace to a specific source. The housekeeper before Leora, a stout woman named Mrs. Petrick, who had worked the estate for 11 years, had vanished on a Tuesday. No note, no forwarding address. Her personal effects were gone from her room, but her winter coat was still hanging in the staff hallway closet, which meant either she'd left in a hurry or she hadn't left on her own terms at all. The staff understood not to ask which. Leora Ashcroft arrived on a Thursday morning in late October, when the oak trees lining the gravel drive had shed half their leaves and the sky sat low and gray over the hills. She came in a black sedan driven by a man named Dreyer, who worked for the estate's staffing agency, and who said exactly 4 words to her during the 40-minute drive from the city. Gate code is 724. She didn't ask any questions. She looked out the window. She was 23 years old with dark hair pulled back and green eyes that took in everything without appearing to notice anything. She carried 1 bag, soft-sided canvas, worn at the corners. The kind of bag a person carries when they've learned not to accumulate things. Dreyer dropped her at the side entrance and left without getting out of the car. The head of household security, a thick-necked man named Vero, who wore his suit jacket the way a wrestler wears a shirt 1 size too small, met her at the door. He looked at her the way men like him always look at someone new, like they were deciding whether to take them seriously or not, and leaning toward not. "You worked private residential before?" he said. "Yes." "How long?" "Long enough." He studied her face for a reaction to his stare. She gave him nothing. He stepped back and let her in. The staff quarters were on the ground floor east wing. 4 rooms, a shared bathroom, a narrow kitchen that smelled of instant coffee and old grease. 2 other staff members were already there. A groundskeeper named Tobias, who was maybe 60 and moved like something in his back had never healed right, and a cook named Renata, who was somewhere in her 40s and watched Leora come through the door with the particular wariness of someone who has learned that new faces bring new problems. "You replacing Petrick," Renata said. "Apparently." "You know what happened to her?" Leora set her bag on the bed in the empty room. "The agency said she took another placement." Renata made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Leora unpacked her bag in under 4 minutes, folded clothes into the dresser, placed a small framed photograph face down on the nightstand without looking at it, hung her 1 good jacket in the closet. That was the sum total of what she'd brought. She lay on the bed for a moment, staring at the ceiling, breathing carefully, counting the seconds the way she'd been trained. In for 4, out for 6. Slow the heart rate, center the body. She wasn't nervous, she was ready. Don Cassian Viscari was not a man who entered rooms. He occupied them. At 52, he still had the physical presence of someone who had spent years being the most dangerous person in any given space. Broad through the shoulders, with hands that were too large for the expensive watches he wore, and a face that had been handsome once before, life had written itself all over it. His hair had gone silver at the temples sometime in his mid-40s, and he'd left it that way. He had a scar that ran from just below his left ear to the corner of his jaw, pale and old, from a knife fight when he was 19 that he'd won by breaking the other man's arm at the elbow. He didn't talk about it. He was on the phone when Varo brought Leora to meet him, standing at the window of his study on the 2nd floor that overlooked the rear gardens and the black iron fence beyond. He had one hand in his trouser pocket and the other holding the phone to his ear, and he was listening rather than talking, which Varro had told her beforehand was unusual. The Don typically dominated every conversation. Whatever was being said on the other end of that line was making him still in the way a predator goes still when it's tracking something. He ended the call without saying goodbye. He turned and looked at her with dark eyes that did the same measuring calculation that Varro's had done. Except where Varro's had leaned toward dismissal, Cassian's arrived at something else, something sharper. He was reading her the way a man reads something he doesn't immediately understand, and he didn't like not understanding things. "You're younger than I expected," he said. "I was told the position required experience, not age." His eyes moved fractionally. "Who told you that?" "The agency." "The agency." He said it like he was tasting the word and finding it mediocre. "Sit down." There was a chair across from his desk. She sat in it with her back straight and her hands in her lap and her gaze level with his in a way that most people, most adults, never mind 23-year-old women, didn't manage in this room. He noticed. She could tell he noticed. "You understand what this house is," he said. It wasn't a question. "I understand it's a private residence that requires discretion." That's one way to put it. He moved away from the window and sat down behind the desk, not with the performative ease of someone trying to look casual, but with the deliberate economy of a man who decided exactly how much energy to spend on every action. "You'll have access to most of the house. The east corridor on the third floor is off limits. The basement is off limits. You don't go in them, you don't ask about them, you don't notice they exist." "Understood. You don't discuss anything you see or hear inside these walls. Not with family, not with friends. If you don't have family or friends, that's better." She held his gaze. "I don't." Something moved through his expression that was too quick to classify. He leaned back in his chair. "Mrs. Petrick worked here for 11 years, he said. "She knew every room, every preference, every routine. You'll need time to learn those things." "I learned quickly." "I've heard that before." He picked up the phone again, not to call anyone, just turning it in his hand the way people handle things when they're thinking. "Varro will give you the house rules. Most of them are common sense. The ones that aren't common sense are the ones you follow most carefully." He looked at her directly. "Any questions?" "One," she said. "Mrs. Petrick's winter coat is still in the staff closet. Should I donate it or keep it?" The question was ordinary, the kind of logistical detail a new housekeeper would reasonably ask, but she watched his face carefully when she asked it, because what a person does with a question like that, how they handle the casual mention of the woman who had occupied this role before, told you something real. Cassian's expression didn't change. "Donate it," he said. "Of course." She stood. "Thank you, Mr. Vescari." He didn't correct her to Dawn. He watched her leave the room, and she felt his eyes on her back until the door closed. In the hallway, out of his sight, she let out one slow breath. First contact. No warnings, no immediate suspicion. She allowed herself exactly 5 seconds of that, and then she started learning the house. The first week was reconnaissance dressed as housework. She cleaned with the methodical thoroughness of someone who genuinely cared about the task, because genuine work was the best cover. Because if you were half-hearted about the mop, you were half-hearted about everything, and people noticed. She learned the staff patterns. Renata started cooking at 6, Tobias began grounds work at 7. The 2 rotating security men on interior duty changed shifts at 8 and at 8 in the evening. She learned which floorboards creaked and on which end. She learned that the third-floor east corridor that Cassian had told her was off-limits had a lock on it that was newer than the one on the front door, which meant it had been added recently, which meant something in there had become important recently. She didn't try the door. She memorized the location of every camera she could identify. There were 11 interior cameras that she could spot, and likely 2 or 3 more she couldn't. She noted the blind spots. She cataloged them not by writing anything down, but by running through them each night before she slept, pressing them into memory the way you press a key into soft wax, slow and deliberate. She watched Cassian. He was not what she'd expected, and she had spent nearly 3 years building an expectation. She'd studied his photograph, his documented patterns, The intelligence assessments compiled on him by people who'd spent longer on him than she had. She had assembled a version of him in her head, a composite made of third-hand accounts and surveillance reports, and the particular way her handler described him, which was the way you describe something dangerous and essentially inhuman. A mechanism with a man's face, a machine for violence that had learned to wear expensive suits. What she found instead was a man who ate alone most mornings, standing at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee that went cold because he forgot to drink it, reading from a leather-bound notebook in which he apparently kept handwritten notes. Not digital, not dictated, but actual pen on paper in a cramped angular script that she caught glimpses of but could never quite read. A man who moved through his own house like he was always listening for something. A man who stopped on the second-floor landing one night when she was polishing the balustrade railing and stood there for almost a full minute looking out through the tall windows at the dark grounds without saying anything, and then went back to wherever he'd come from without seeming to notice she was there. He had people around him constantly, lieutenants, security, the men who came and went through the rear entrance with their faces arranged into careful blankness. But he was alone in the way that some people are always alone regardless of the bodies around them. She recognized it the way you recognize a language you were raised with in someone else's voice, somewhere you didn't expect to hear it. She shut that recognition down. She was here to do a job. On the 9th day, a man died on the property. She didn't witness it directly. She heard the 3 gunshots from the east end of the grounds around 2 in the afternoon, flat and distant through the stone walls, and then 40 minutes of loaded silence, and then the sound of a vehicle leaving through the rear gate. When she came down to start the afternoon cleaning, there was a dark stain on the flagstones of the rear courtyard that Tobias was hosing down with a pressure washer, his face arranged into the practiced blankness of someone who has done this before. She did not ask what happened. She cleaned the rooms she was supposed to clean. But that night, when the house went quiet and she sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the dark, she opened the small framed photograph on her nightstand, the one she'd placed face down when she arrived, and held it in both hands. The man in the photo was in his 40s, with sandy hair going gray and a wide, easy grin and eyes that were the same shade of green as hers. He was standing in front of a brick building on a day with good light, and he was laughing at something outside the frame. He looked like a man who laughed easily. He'd been that kind of man. She looked at the photo for 30 seconds. Then she placed it face down again and lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about nothing until she could sleep. The first time she saved him, she wasn't entirely sure she'd meant to. It was the second week. She was cleaning the main staircase, moving down from the upper landing with a cloth and a spray bottle, when she heard the particular quality of silence that meant something was wrong before she could have explained why. A gap in the normal ambient sound of the house. No footsteps from the kitchen, no Varro's periodic check-in radio traffic. Nothing. Just the kind of quiet that fills a space like water fills a container, pressing into every corner. She had already moved toward the front hallway before she'd consciously decided to, because her training had drilled certain responses below the threshold of thought, had made her body do things before her mind signed off on them. And when she came around the corner, she saw the man in the dark coat at the end of the hall, near the side entrance, who was not Varro, who was not any of the security rotation, who was moving toward the study door with one hand inside his jacket in a way that was unmistakably purposeful. She did not have a weapon on her. She had a spray bottle of cleaning solution and a cloth and the element of surprise. She called out, loud, cheerful, ordinary. "Oh, Mr. Varro said you'd be here for the carpet in the study. Should I come back later, or—" The man stopped and turned and looked at her. And in his eyes she saw the particular recalculation of someone whose plan has just acquired an unexpected variable. She was standing in the middle of the hallway between him and his exit, and she was a small woman in a domestic uniform holding cleaning supplies, which was exactly what she wanted him to see. And she was watching the tension in his right shoulder that would telegraph whether he was going to decide she was a problem. He decided she was a problem. He reached inside his jacket. She threw the spray bottle underhand, hard, aimed at his face. And when he flinched away, she crossed the distance between them in 4 steps and hit the inside of his wrist with the heel of her hand, deflecting the weapon, then drove her elbow into his jaw with enough force to send him sideways into the wall. He dropped. She stepped back and was already breathing carefully, already composing her face back into something ordinary by the time Vero came around the corner at a run with his hand on his holster. She said, "He came through the side door. The lock may be compromised." Vero stared at her, then at the man on the floor, then back at her. "What did you—" "He reached for his jacket," she said. "I reacted. I'm sorry if I overstepped." She said it with exactly the right amount of embarrassed deference. The you know how it is of someone who'd maybe taken a self-defense class once. Vero's mouth opened and closed. Cassian appeared at the top of the stairs. He looked at the man on the floor. He looked at Leora. His face was doing the reading thing again, taking her apart piece by piece and trying to understand what he was seeing. "He said the lock was compromised," Vero said, pulling himself together. Cassian descended the stairs slowly, not with urgency, in the particular way of a man who refuses to let anything make him hurry. He stopped at the bottom and looked at Leora for a long moment. "You have quick reflexes for a housekeeper," he said. "I've lived alone a long time," she said. "You learn." He held her gaze. There was something happening behind his eyes that she couldn't entirely track. Not suspicion, exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something like recognition without context. "Get Dreyer to check the lock," he said to Vero without looking away from her. Then to her, "You can go back to whatever you were doing." "Yes, sir." She went back to the staircase. She picked up her cloth. She continued polishing the railing, moving steadily downward, her hands perfectly steady. She could feel him watching her. After that, things shifted in ways that were subtle and difficult to name. He started appearing in rooms she was working in. Not intrusively, not in a way that would read as deliberate, but with the particular frequency of someone who had started mapping someone else's schedule. He'd come into the dining room while she was polishing silver and stand at the window for 10 minutes with his coffee. He'd stop in the corridor outside the library while she was restacking shelves and make a phone call. He could have made anywhere in the house from right there. He didn't speak to her most of these times. Sometimes he did. Brief, practically worded exchanges about the state of a room or a request for something specific. But even in the silences, there was a quality of attention that she registered as significant and had to consciously decide not to respond to. She was not there to be responded to. She was there to gather intelligence, to document the criminal network structure, to build the evidentiary foundation for prosecutions that would take down not just Cassian, but the 5 other families whose operations intersected with his. That was the mission. That was what she owed the task force. That was what she owed her father. She kept her encrypted communication device in the lining of her canvas bag, tucked beneath a false bottom she'd sewn in herself. Every 3 days she compiled what she'd gathered: names, faces, partial conversations, the pattern of who came and went and when, and transmitted it in a burst that lasted 11 seconds. She'd been told 11 seconds was below the threshold of the estate's signal detection equipment. She'd been told by people who were very confident and who had never been inside the estate themselves, which was the kind of thing she tried not to think about too directly. Her handler was a man she knew only as Crow. He communicated in short bursts of text that were stripped of anything personal or contextual, the way you communicate with someone when you assume both ends of the conversation might someday be read by parties who weren't meant to see it. Subject's financial routing has changed, previous accounts closed, new routing needed. Consigliere a did. Need confirmation of Morano's direct access. Timeline has moved up. 6 weeks. 6 weeks. She'd been in the house for 12 days. The original timeline had been 4 months. She sat in her room after Crow's last message, the device already back in its hiding place, and thought about what 6 weeks meant in practical terms. It meant she needed to get into the East Wing. It meant she needed to get close enough to Cassian's inner operations to document them specifically enough to be legally actionable. It meant she needed to do all of that while maintaining the fiction of being exactly what she appeared to be. It was possible. She'd been trained for compressed timelines. What she hadn't been trained for, what no amount of training could fully insulate you from, was the specific gravity of being around someone who was not what you'd been told they were, who was worse in some ways and profoundly different in others, who occupied space in a way that kept pulling at the edge of your attention like a splinter you couldn't stop noticing. She was not developing feelings for Cassian Viscari. She was noting, professionally, that her initial intelligence assessment had been incomplete. That was all. The first real conversation happened on a Wednesday night, past 11, when she found him in the kitchen. This was unexpected. In nearly 3 weeks, she had not seen him in the kitchen after 9. The kitchen was Renata's territory in the evenings, and Cassian occupied his own spaces with the rigid territorial sense of someone who has learned that predictability and control are close cousins. But there he was, standing at the counter in a dark shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, eating cold roast chicken directly from the pan with his hands in a way that was so completely at odds with the formal authority of every other version of her she'd observed him in that she stopped in the doorway. He looked up. Neither of them said anything for a beat. "I was going to make tea," she said. "Make it," he said. She came in and filled the kettle and set it on the stove and got a mug from the cabinet, moving around him with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew exactly where everything was. He watched her with that reading expression and kept eating. "You don't sleep much," he said. "Neither do you, apparently." He made a sound that might have been amusement. "I sleep when it's safe." "When is it safe?" "It isn't." He set the pan aside and leaned back against the counter with his arms folded. "You've been here 3 weeks, 22 days, and you haven't asked me a single personal question." She got her tea bag and poured the water when the kettle clicked. "You told me not to." "I told you not to discuss what you see and hear. I didn't say anything about questions." She turned to look at him. "What would you like me to ask?" He held her gaze. "That's not how questions work." "Then ask me something," she said. "If you want to know something." A pause. The kitchen was quiet, just the particular hum of the refrigerator and the sound of wind against the window glass. He was looking at her with the unblinking steadiness of someone who is accustomed to people backing down from sustained eye contact. She didn't back down. "Why aren't you afraid of me?" he said. She wrapped both hands around her mug, considered. "Because you haven't given me a reason to be." "I've given everyone in this house a reason to be." "You've given them reasons to be afraid of what you might do. That's different from being afraid of who you are." Something moved through his face, quick, almost involuntary, like a muscle memory of an expression he'd trained himself out of having. He looked away first, toward the dark window. "Most people find that distinction irrelevant," he said. "Most people aren't paying attention." She picked up her tea. "Good night, Mr. Viscari." She went back to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a long time, mug in her hand, staring at the face-down photograph. Most people aren't paying attention. She had said it automatically, the way you say something true before you've decided whether you meant to. And it was true. She was paying attention more than she was supposed to be, more than was professionally advisable, more than made things simple or clean. She needed to be more careful. She told herself that very clearly, in the flat internal voice she used for operational self-assessments, and then she drank her tea and tried to believe it. The package arrived on a Friday. It came via one of the estate's regular couriers, a nondescript man who brought things twice a week through the rear gate and handed them to Vero, always sealed, always logged in a physical ledger that Vero kept in the security office. This particular package was flagged differently. Leora could tell because Varro brought it upstairs himself rather than leaving it in the entry for collection, and because of the way he knocked on the study door. 2 knocks, pause, 1 knock, which she had learned was the code for something that required immediate attention. She was cleaning the hallway outside the study. She heard nothing specific from inside. The walls were solid stone and a foot thick, designed by a paranoid man in a paranoid era, but she could time the conversation by how long Vero stayed in the room. He stayed for 9 minutes, which was 4 minutes longer than his typical security briefings. When he came out, his face was arranged into careful blankness, but his jaw was tight. After he left, she finished the hallway and moved to the next room. That evening, at dinner prep, she overheard Renata telling Tobias in a low voice that the Forenza family had sent a message. Tobias told her to keep her head down. They both looked up when Leora came into the kitchen and the conversation stopped. She asked them what they needed for tomorrow's breakfast and wrote it down and didn't react to the name Forenza at all, because she already knew exactly who the Forenza family was. She'd known before she ever walked through the estate's front door. Quote, the attempt on Cassian's life happened on a Tuesday morning, his fourth since she'd arrived, and it was the most serious one. She knew it was serious because she saw the two men positioned outside the east fence 20 minutes before anything happened, saw them because she'd made it her habit, from the first week, to look at the grounds from every window she passed, building a continuous mental model of who was where. And these two were not where anyone should have been. They were in the tree line past the east fence, partially obscured, but the angle of light was wrong for them. They'd positioned themselves thinking about sight lines from the security cameras, not accounting for the upper floor windows. She went immediately to the ground floor and found Varro. There are two men in the tree line east side, she said. Past the fence. One is elevated, probably has a rifle. Varro looked at her the way he always looked at her when she said something that didn't fit his understanding of who she was supposed to be. How do you... Upper east window, second floor. I was doing the guest room. Please. He got on the radio. She went to find Cassian. He was in the dining room with two of his lieutenants, a heavy-set man she knew as Brandt and a younger one whose name she'd never heard spoken, both of them standing at the long table with papers spread out in front of them. He looked up when she came in. I need to speak with you, she said. Brandt turned to look at her with the particular impatience of a man who has been interrupted. He's occupied. There are men outside with a rifle, she said, to Cassian specifically, not to Brandt. You need to move away from the windows right now. The window directly behind where Cassian was standing was 8 feet tall and faced east. Cassian held her gaze for exactly 1 second. Then he moved, not scrambling, not panicking, but decisively, stepping sideways out of the line of the window in the same fluid way she'd seen him do everything. He was already reaching for his phone. The window exploded inward 2 seconds later. The shot was high. It would have taken him in the shoulder or neck if he hadn't moved, and it punched through the glass and buried itself in the far wall in an eruption of plaster and old paint. Brandt was already on the ground with his arms over his head. The younger lieutenant had his weapon drawn and was moving toward the wall. Cassian was standing with his back flat against the interior wall, glass fragments on his shoulder, looking at Leora. She was standing in the doorway, which was exactly as far inside the room as she'd allowed herself to go, and she had not flinched. How did you see them? He said. I told Varro. He's handling the perimeter. That's not what I asked. His voice was completely level. Everything about him was completely level, in the aftermath of someone having just attempted to put a bullet through him, and that steadiness was something she recognized because she had it too. The trained capacity to stand in the wreckage of a near miss and function. How did you see men in the tree line past the east fence from a second-floor window while you were cleaning a guest room? I pay attention, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face had shifted. The reading expression was gone, replaced by something she couldn't easily categorize. Yes, he said quietly. You do. Outside, she could hear Varro's security team engaging at the perimeter. Short bursts of radio traffic, boots on gravel, the distant flat crack of 2 more shots from somewhere in the trees that then went silent. She stayed in the doorway until it was clear Cassian wasn't going to push further, and then she said, I'll clean up the glass, and went to get a broom and did not allow herself to examine too carefully what it meant that her pulse had been absolutely steady until she was 30 feet away from him, and then, for approximately 4 seconds, was not. That night, Crow's message came through at midnight. Identify Morano's direct chain. Evidence on the Forenza contract needed within 2 weeks. Timeline compressed further. 4 weeks total remaining. She stared at the message for a long time. 4 weeks. She read it again. Below it, another line. Do not develop personal complications. She almost sent something back. Something sharp and ungracious. Instead, she transmitted her standard confirmation. 3 characters, meaning received and understood, and put the device back in its hiding place. Do not develop personal complications. She lay on her back in the dark. She thought about Cassian standing against the wall with glass on his shoulder, asking her how she'd seen the men in the tree line. She thought about the kitchen at midnight. She thought about you've given them reasons to be afraid of what you might do. That's different from being afraid of who you are. She thought about the man in the photograph, face down on the nightstand. She reached out and didn't touch it. Outside, the wind was picking up. She could hear it against the high windows of the estate. That sound that old stone buildings make when weather moves against them. The low structural moan of something large and solid holding its ground. 4 weeks. She turned onto her side and closed her eyes, and in the dark behind them she saw Cassian's face doing the thing it did when he looked at her. That particular quality of attention she had no clean professional name for, that she was running out of ways to file as something other than what it was. She had a mission. She was going to complete it. And she was going to keep not thinking about the fact that completing it meant the man whose life she had just saved would spend whatever remained of his life in a federal penitentiary. She pressed her eyes shut harder. In the morning, there was work to do. Bishtin. The confrontation with Silas Morano happened by accident, which was the worst way for that kind of confrontation to happen. He arrived on a Thursday in the 3rd week, a lean, silver-haired man in his early 60s with the long, careful face of someone who had spent decades appearing reasonable. He was Cassian's consigliere, his closest advisor, the man who had been at the center of the Viscari operation since before Cassian had fully taken it over from his predecessor. In the intelligence files she'd memorized, Morano had 3 pages to himself, not for the crimes directly attributed to him, which were careful and difficult to prosecute, but for the crimes that seemed to orbit him at a fixed distance, always close enough to suggest involvement and always just far enough to deny it. She was restocking the bar cart in the second-floor sitting room when she heard Morano and Cassian in the study, their voices carrying through the open study door across the hall. Not the words, but the particular quality of the exchange, which was different from what she'd heard in Cassian's other meetings. Lower, more careful. The specific register of 2 men who have history with each other discussing something that existed in the space between them where other people's rules didn't apply. She moved closer to the hallway slowly, making small sounds with the bar cart to justify her presence, listening. Cassian. The Forenza contract was not authorized. Morano. It was necessary. Cassian. By whose judgment? A pause. Then Morano, his voice patient in the particular way of a man who has given this answer before. By the judgment of someone who needed to act before a window closed. You mean before I could make a different call? I mean before the opportunity was lost. She had reached a position where she could see through the crack of the open door. Cassian was standing, Morano was seated. A reversal of the normal configuration of their meetings, she noted, which she'd observed twice before through this same door. The sitting posture was deliberate, a performance of ease designed to project something. Cassian. Who else knew? Not a question, a taking of inventory. Morano without pausing. Brandt, the channel through which the order moved. 3 others you haven't met. And you didn't think I needed to. I think there are things you're better positioned to know after the fact. I've always thought that. You know I've always thought that. Cassian's face, visible through the crack, was absolutely still. The stillness that was the opposite of calm. 3 years, he said. I've served this organization for... I'm not talking about your service. The quality of his voice had changed. Something had been removed from it, some remaining pretense of negotiation. I'm talking about the Ashcroft file. The name hit Leora in the sternum like a physical blow. Her hands went still on the bar cart. Morano said nothing for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was still measured. That was a federal matter, an undercover... His name was Martin Ashcroft, Cassian said. He was 44 years old. He had a daughter. The sitting room felt like it had contracted by several degrees. She could not move. She stood in the hallway with her hands on the bar cart, and she heard her father's name in the mouth of the man she had come here to destroy, said with a weight that didn't belong in a criminal study, said like an accusation or a confession, she couldn't tell which. That was handled appropriately given the circumstances, Morano said. You told me he was an active threat. You told me the intelligence confirmed it and there was no time. It was the correct... He was a father going home. Cassian's voice was flat and hard and empty of anything she could use to understand what it meant. I read the actual file 2 months ago, all of it, not the version you showed me. a silence that had weight. "You've known for 2 months," Morano said. "Yes." "And you waited." "I wanted to understand the whole shape of it first." Leora's pulse was a single steady drumbeat in her ears. Her father's name, in this room, spoken by both of these men. She had spent nearly 3 years building a version of events out of fragments and second-hand intelligence, and the particular grief of not knowing everything. And this was... She couldn't think straight. She took 3 careful steps backward, moving without sound, and turned back toward the bar cart and began making entirely unnecessary adjustments to it, her hands performing the task automatically while her mind processed what she'd just heard. Cassian had known about her father for 2 months. He had read the actual file. He had been sitting with it for 2 months in this house, eating alone in the morning, standing at windows in the dark, crossing paths with her in hallways and kitchens and on staircases. She gripped the edge of the cart. She had not been sent here because the task force had identified an opportunity. She had been sent here because someone had sent her here, and she needed to understand now, immediately, whether the someone who had built her mission was named Crow, or whether the someone who had built it had a leaner face and careful hands and silver hair and 3 pages in an intelligence file she'd memorized in a room 600 miles away. This thought arrived complete and cold and fully formed, like something that had been waiting for the right moment, and it changed the shape of everything. She pushed the bar cart back toward the sitting room. She went inside and continued stalking the bar as if none of her understanding of the world had just reorganized itself entirely around a new axis. Her hands were completely steady. Her heart was not. That night she didn't transmit. She held the device in both hands for a long time in the dark, turning it over, thinking about the compressed timeline and Crow's message, and do not develop personal complications, and the name Martin Ashcroft spoken in Cassian's voice like a weight he'd been carrying. She thought about who needed her inside this house, and why, and who stood to benefit from the evidence she was building, and whether the person who had designed her mission was the person she believed had designed it. She pressed the device's edges with her thumbs, then she put it back in the bag without transmitting. Outside the high windows of the estate, the wind was still moving, steady and cold, through the trees that lined the gravel drive, where she had arrived on a Thursday morning in October with 1 bag and a face that had given nothing away. She lay in the dark. She thought about her father's name. She thought about Cassian's voice saying it. She thought about the photograph face down on the nightstand, and the weight of it, and the 3 years she had spent converting grief into purpose and purpose into motion, and how that motion had carried her to this bed in this room, in this house, inside the fortress of the man she'd been sent to destroy, who had apparently, for 2 months now, been sitting with a truth that could burn both of them to the ground, and had not yet decided what to do with it. She was 23 years old, and she had no family, and she had not slept in a bed that felt safe in longer than she could clearly remember. The mission was still the mission. She told herself that. In the dark of the estate, somewhere above her, she heard footsteps moving slowly down the corridor of the 2nd floor. The particular weight and rhythm of one specific person, unhurried, restless, walking through the night the way you walk when sleep has become a country you no longer know how to get to. She listened until the footsteps stopped. She listened to the silence they left behind. And in the cold and the dark, with her father's name still reverberating somewhere behind her sternum, she felt the mission beginning to fracture along a line she had not seen coming. A thin, bright crack running through everything she thought she knew about why she was here and who had put her here and what the truth, the full and actual truth, was going to cost. She did not sleep. She lay on her back in the narrow bed and watched the ceiling go from black to gray as the hours moved, listening to the estate settle around her. The particular vocabulary of an old stone building at night. The contractions and expansions that sounded almost like breathing if you listened long enough. She had learned the house's sounds the way she'd learned everything else here, methodically, without sentiment, cataloging each creak and groan until the building had no surprises left in it. Except now, it did. Cassian had known about her father for 2 months. She turned this fact over the way you turn something sharp in your hands. Carefully, feeling for the edges, trying to understand the full geometry of it. He had read the actual file. Not Morano's version, not the sanitized operational summary that had apparently been constructed to make the killing of Martin Ashcroft look like a necessary response to an active threat. The actual file, which meant he knew her father had been an undercover federal agent, which meant he knew the killing had been what exactly? A mistake? A manipulation? Both? And he had been sitting with that knowledge for 2 months, while she was in his house. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes until she saw a pressure light behind them. The question that mattered, the one she needed to think around carefully rather than directly, because thinking it directly felt like looking at something too bright, was whether Cassian had read that file before or after she arrived. Whether the file had anything in it that could connect her to Martin Ashcroft. Whether 2 months ago was before or after Crow had placed her here. She did the math twice. The timing was close enough to matter. By the time the ceiling had gone from gray to pale, she had not reached a conclusion, so much as she had reached the edge of what she could figure out alone in a dark room. And she got up and washed her face in cold water and put on her uniform and went to work, because the house needed cleaning, whether or not her entire operational framework had just developed a serious structural crack. Renata was already in the kitchen when she came down, moving around the stove with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to function in a space that was not entirely hers. She looked up when Leora came in and then looked away, which was what she usually did. Except this morning, there was something slightly different in the quality of the look away. Something clipped. Leora filled the kettle. "Something wrong?" she said. "Nothing's wrong." Renata cracked eggs into a bowl without looking up. "You're doing the thing where you look at me and then decide not to." Renata's hands slowed. Then, "Varro was asking about you this morning." "What kind of asking?" "The kind where he's already decided the answer and he's looking for someone to confirm it." She set the bowl down. Looked at Leora directly now, with the pragmatic directness of a woman who had lasted this long in this house by being honest with herself about things. "He thinks you're more than what you said you were." "I'm a housekeeper." "You put a man on the floor in the front hallway without a weapon." "I told him that was—" "I know what you told him. I'm telling you what he thinks." Renata picked up the bowl again. "I'm not asking you anything. I'm telling you to be careful, because Varro doesn't let things go. And when he goes to the Don with something he's decided, the Don listens." Leora held her mug in both hands. "Why are you telling me this?" Renata was quiet for a moment. The eggs moved in the pan. "Because Petrick was here 11 years, she said finally, "and she left in the middle of winter without her coat." She didn't say anything else after that. Leora drank her tea and thought about Varro. He found her at 10 in the morning in the east hallway, which meant he'd been tracking her schedule, for long enough to know where she'd be. This was the first concrete confirmation that Renata's warning had been understated. "I need a few minutes," he said. "Of course." She set down the polishing cloth. He didn't take her anywhere private, which was telling. He stood in the hallway and kept his voice low and his body positioned to see both directions. A man having a conversation he wanted to be able to deny having. "Where did you train?" he said. "I'm sorry?" "The man in the front hall. The way you moved." He was watching her face with the specific quality of attention of someone who has watched a lot of people lie and has developed a calibrated sense for the gap between a face and what's behind it. "That wasn't a self-defense class." I reacted. "You displaced his weapon, then used an elbow strike. That's a sequence. Sequences are trained." She met his eyes steadily. "My father was in the military. He trained me when I was young. I don't talk about it." "What branch?" "Marines." "What was his MOS?" She gave him a number without pausing, because she'd built this backstory with the same methodical preparation she'd applied to everything else here, and it held up because it was specific, and it was internally consistent, and there was a real man somewhere whose service record roughly matched the shape of it. Varro absorbed this. His jaw was still tight. "There's something off about you," he said. "I've been doing this for 15 years and I can feel when something's off." "I understand." She kept her voice neutral, not defensive. "I'd rather you feel that and say it to my face than say it somewhere else." This slightly disarmed him. She could see it, the fractional recalibration. He'd expected deflection. "I'm going to find out," he said. Not a threat exactly, a statement of intent. "Then you'll find out," she said. "Can I get back to work?" He studied her for another 3 seconds. Then he stepped aside. She went back to the polishing cloth. She kept her breathing even until she heard his footsteps recede down the corridor, and then she gave herself 10 seconds of very quiet, very controlled reckoning with the fact that Varro was going to dig, and she had maybe 4 days before he dug up something that didn't fit, because no cover was complete, because covers were architecture built to pass inspection from a specific angle, and Varro was beginning to move around to the other side. 4 days. She needed to accelerate. The opportunity came from Murano. He was staying in the guest suite on the second floor, which was unusual. He normally came for meetings and left, and the unusual duration of his stay combined with what she'd overheard through the study door put her on alert. Men like Murano didn't extend their presence without reason. He was managing something, either managing Cassian's response to whatever had been said between them, or managing something that ran parallel to it that she didn't yet fully see. She went in to service the guest suite at 2 in the afternoon when Murano was downstairs. The room was immaculate in the particular way of a man who travels frequently and has learned to leave no trace. Clothes in the wardrobe, but arranged with a systematic precision that would register any disturbance. Toiletries aligned on the bathroom shelf by size. She photographed the arrangement with the small lens threaded into her uniform button before she touched anything, so she could restore it exactly. His briefcase was closed and locked, which she had expected. His phone was not in the room, which she had also expected. What she hadn't expected was the second phone, a burner, disposable, the kind with a prepaid SIM, in the inner breast pocket of the jacket hanging on the wardrobe door. She found it because she was checking the jacket's pockets as part of cleaning protocol before pressing, which was a legitimate reason to be in that pocket. And when her fingers found the flat rectangle, she went very still for a moment. She took it out. It was powered off. She didn't power it on. Turning on someone else's phone generated heat and activation logs, and she wasn't equipped to manage those risks right now. But she held it and noted the model and the specific wear patterns on the case and the faint residue of a sticker on the back that had been partially removed, and she photographed all of this before replacing it exactly where she'd found it. A second phone. A consigliere who had apparently manipulated his employer's operations for years using evidence his employer hadn't seen. A compressed timeline from an external handler she was no longer entirely certain she trusted. She restored the room to its exact pre-entry state and left. Cassian found her at 3. She was on the rear terrace sweeping leaves when she heard the door open behind her and felt, before she turned, the particular quality of presence that preceded him. He came out in his shirt sleeves, no jacket, which was not his usual, and stood with his hands in his pockets looking at the rear grounds, the brown November grass and the skeletal tree line beyond the iron fence. And he didn't say anything immediately, which meant he'd come out here to say something specific and was deciding how to begin it. She kept sweeping. "Murano's leaving tonight," he said. "I'll have the suite ready." Pause. "That's not—" He stopped, started over. "I need to ask you something." "All right. What did you hear yesterday?" The broom moved through a cluster of leaves, steady, unhurried. "I'm not sure what you mean." "You were in the sitting room across from the study." His voice was completely level. "The door was open. You were there for 20 minutes. She stopped sweeping. She looked at him. He was watching her with that direct, unblinking attention that she'd come to recognize as his version of honesty. When he wanted to know something real, the performance of authority dropped, and what was left was just a man looking at another person and waiting. "Yes," she said. "What did you hear?" A beat. Then, enough. He absorbed this. Something moved through his face, not surprise, more like confirmation. He had suspected she'd heard, and he'd come out here to know for certain, and now he did, and he was processing what that meant. "Which part?" he said. She held his gaze. "You said his name." The silence that followed had texture. He looked away from her toward the fence, and she watched his jaw tighten and then deliberately relax, the small, muscular performance of a man controlling his own face. "You don't have a reaction to that," he said. "A normal person would react." "I'm reacting." "Not visibly." "I've learned not to." She said it flat, factual, without inflection, and she watched it land on him. Watched him process the specific weight of "I've learned not to" and what that learning might have required. He turned back to look at her. His eyes were doing something complicated. "The file said he had a daughter," he said. She held his gaze and said nothing. 23, he said. "Dark hair. Last known location 6 months ago was—" "Stop." Her voice came out steady. She hadn't planned to say anything. She said it anyway. He stopped. They looked at each other on the rear terrace in the cold November air, with the leaves moving between them and the iron fence behind him, and the whole architecture of what they were to each other, what she'd pretended to be, what he was only just beginning to understand, pressing in from all sides. "Are you going to do something about it?" she said. He was quiet for a long time. "I don't know yet," he said. It was the most honest thing she had heard anyone say in months. She picked up the broom. She finished sweeping the terrace. He stood there until she was done, and then went back inside without another word, and she kept her face composed and her movements steady, and did not turn to watch him go. And when she was certain she was alone, she gripped the broom handle hard enough that her knuckles went pale, and stood there in the cold for 60 seconds, reminding herself what she was here for. Boom. Morano left at 6 in the evening. She watched from the upstairs window as his car cleared the rear gate. The particular smooth exit of a man who has concluded what he came to do. She had 3 hours before her next scheduled transmission, and she had decisions to make. She went to service the guest suite. He'd left nothing behind, which was expected, but she checked the room with the thoroughness she applied to everything, moving systematically from the wardrobe to the nightstand to the bathroom, and on the underside of the second drawer of the nightstand she found the adhesive note. Small. A phone number and 8 characters that were either a password or a file reference. Nothing else. She photographed it. She thought about Crow. She thought about timeline compressed, 4 weeks. She thought about who benefited from her being inside this house right now, at this particular moment, when Cassian and Morano were in open tension, when the Viscari organization was destabilized, when the evidence she was gathering was moving toward something that could bring the whole structure down simultaneously. Cassian, Morano, the lieutenants, the financial network. She thought about how intelligence operations work, how they use people, how a woman with a dead father and 3 years of training and a legitimate personal motive was the exact shape of tool a certain kind of operation needed for a certain kind of job. She replaced the nightstand drawer. She stood in the empty guest suite for a moment. Then she went back to her room and took out the device and looked at it and thought about the 8 characters on the underside of Morano's nightstand drawer, and thought about whether her handler and the consigliere were strangers to each other, and how long it would take her to find out, and what she would do when she sat with that unfinished thought for a long time. The device was cold in her hands. The room was dark. Outside the high windows, the last of the evening light had gone, and the grounds were black and still. And she was sitting on the edge of her bed in the dark, holding a piece of equipment that connected her to a man named Crow, who had given her a compressed timeline and a dead father's mission and the specific shape of a tool built for a specific job. And she was only now, too late, possibly, catastrophically late, beginning to ask who had built the tool and what they actually intended to use it for. She powered on the device. She did not transmit her scheduled report. Instead, she typed a single query into the secure channel. Confirm origin of Ashcroft file acquisition. She waited. Crow's response came in 40 seconds, which was faster than usual, which meant he was monitoring the channel in real time tonight, which meant tonight was significant to him for reasons he hadn't shared with her. Acquired through standard federal interdiction. Why? Standard federal interdiction. She read it twice. She typed, "When was it acquired relative to my placement?" A longer pause this time. 19 seconds. That's not relevant to your current objectives. She stared at that for a long moment. Then she powered the device off, replaced it, and lay back on the bed in the dark with her hands flat on her stomach and her eyes open. And she thought about the 8 characters on the underside of Morano's nightstand drawer. And she thought about a consigliere who had spent years manipulating his employer and covering his tracks. And she thought about the specific flavor of "that's not relevant," which was the flavor of an answer that was in fact extremely relevant, and that the answer had decided she didn't need to know. She thought about her father. She thought about all the ways a person could be used. Then she got up because lying still was not something she could afford anymore. And she started to plan. She found the connection at 2 in the morning, not through the device. She didn't trust the device for this anymore. She found it through the physical ledger. Vero kept the delivery log in the security office on the ground floor, a room she had legitimate access to twice a week for cleaning, and she had noted weeks ago that he kept the ledger in the unlocked cabinet beneath the secondary monitor rather than the locked drawer where he kept the weapons logs, because Vero was meticulous about the things he thought mattered and less careful about the things he'd decided didn't. The delivery ledger was, to Vero, administrative, not a security document. She moved through the ground floor in the dark with the quiet of someone who has memorized every board that speaks and every shadow that covers. The security office door was locked, but the lock was the same model as the one on the staff supply closet, which she had a key for, and which she had noted in the second week used the same keyway. She had ground a copy of the supply closet key using a file she'd taken from Tobias's groundskeeping shed and replaced before he noticed. She used it now. Inside, she worked by the light of her phone screen turned to minimum brightness, moving fast, hands steady. The ledger covered 14 months. She found Morano's most recent visits first, 6 in the past 3 months, which was more than double his previous frequency. She noted the dates. She noted the courier deliveries that coincided with 3 of those visits. She noted a specific courier company name, Helix Transit Solutions, that appeared on 4 deliveries in the past 2 months and 0 times in the preceding 12. She photographed every relevant page. Then she found the name. It was in the courier log from 6 weeks ago, a delivery notation that included, unlike all the others, a sender reference code, 8 characters. The same 8 characters she'd found on the underside of Morano's nightstand drawer. She looked at this for a long time. The sender reference for a delivery to Cassian Viscari's estate, routed through a courier company that had no presence in the ledger before 2 months ago, matched the reference code left by Morano in a room he'd just vacated. Morano hadn't left a dead drop for someone inside the estate. He'd left confirmation that something had already been delivered. She photographed it, replaced the ledger, and was out of the security office in under 6 minutes. Back in her room, door closed, she sat on the floor with her back against the bed and laid out what she had in the specific way she'd been trained to lay out fragmentary intelligence. Not as a narrative, because narrative was how you made things fit that didn't fit, but as a set of discrete facts in proximity to each other, waiting to see what shape they made. Morano. A second phone. A reference code. A courier company that appeared 2 months ago. A compressed timeline from Crow. Acquired through standard federal interdiction. Standard federal interdiction meant the file had been obtained as part of an investigation. An ongoing investigation would have a case number, a lead agency, a chain of custody. Those things were documentable. The fact that Crow hadn't told her when the file was acquired relative to her placement, had deflected rather than answered, meant the timing was the problem. The timing was what he didn't want her thinking about. If the Ashcroft file had been acquired and her placement had been constructed around it, not as a consequence of the investigation, but as the investigation itself, designed from the beginning to use her grief as an operational instrument, then the question of who had provided the file to the task force became the question that explained everything else. She thought about Morano's 3 pages in the intelligence files. She thought about a consigliere who had spent decades managing information, who had constructed false evidence and buried it inside the Viscari operation, who had the contacts, the motive, and the specific skill set to identify a grieving 20-year-old girl with the right last name and the right combination of capability and anger, and to make sure that girl ended up in the hands of a task force that would train her and aim her and send her here. She thought about Cassian saying, "I read the actual file 2 months ago." 2 months ago. The same 2 months in which Helix Transit Solutions had begun making deliveries to the estate. The same 2 months in which Crow's timeline had begun accelerating. She pressed the back of her skull against the bed frame. She had been aimed. The question was, at what exactly? In. She slept for 2 hours and was up before Renata. She made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and watched the grounds come out of the dark. The frost on the grass, the long early shadows of the bare trees across the rear lawn, and she was still standing there when Cassian came in at 6:10, which was 40 minutes earlier than his usual time, and she could tell from the quality of his movement, the controlled speed of it, the way his jaw was set, that something had already happened this morning. He stopped when he saw her. "You're up early," he said. "I could say the same." He went for the coffee without responding, and she watched him pour it and drink half of it standing at the counter, and then he set the cup down and looked at her. "There was an incident last night," he said. "East fence. One of my men." She waited. "Someone tried to pull him." The word was precise, not attack, not confront. Pull, as in extract, as in turn him, as in someone had made a recruitment approach. He reported it this morning, said they offered him money and information about how to walk away clean. She kept her face composed. "Is he—" "He's fine. He came to me." Cassian looked down at his coffee cup. "But it means someone outside knows enough about my staff rotation to know which of them might be reachable. Varro's people are investigating. Varro's investigating everything right now." His eyes came back up. There was something direct in them, stripped of the usual layering. "Including you." She held his gaze. "I know," she said. "That doesn't concern you." "Whether it concerns me or not doesn't change what he finds." "And what does he find?" "A housekeeper," she said, "with good reflexes and no family." Cassian looked at her for a long moment. The kitchen was quiet. Somewhere outside, Tobias was already moving through the frost on the back lawn, his uneven gait audible on the gravel. "You heard what I said to Morano," Cassian said. "About the file." "Yes." "Then you know I know who you are." The directness of it landed without warning, not the content, which she'd been preparing for, but the delivery, which was absent of aggression or threat, which was just a man stating a fact he'd been sitting with for too long. She held herself very still. "Then you know why I'm here," she said. "I know why you think you're here." He set the cup down. "What I'm not sure you know is who actually sent you." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 2 degrees. "What does that mean?" she said. "Morano has a contact," Cassian said. "Someone external. Someone who's been feeding him information about my operations for at least 8 months. I've been trying to identify them for 6. He looked at her directly. 3 weeks ago I got a partial, a task force, a handler who operates under a cover name. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips. "Crow," she said. Something moved through his face, surprise, quickly compressed. He hadn't expected her to have the name. She watched him reassess her in real time, watched the recalculation behind his eyes. "You already know," he said. "I suspected, last night." She kept her voice flat. "I found a reference code in Morano's room that matched a delivery to this estate. The timeline fits a coordinated operation, not a standard federal placement." He was looking at her differently now. The way he'd looked at her in the aftermath of the window. That quality of re-seeing something he thought he'd already understood. "How long have you been running that analysis?" he said. "About 6 hours. "And before that?" "Before that, I was following a mission brief I thought I could trust." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Your father's file. It was given to the task force by someone who wanted it in federal hands, who wanted it to generate exactly the kind of operative it generated." She heard this. She heard the shape of it and the weight of it and the specific violence of it. Not physical, not the kind she'd been trained for, but the kind that reorganized everything, that reached back through 3 years of grief and purpose and turned them inside out. "Morano," she said. "Morano identified your father as a liability 2 years before the operation that killed him. He managed the process. He managed the cover story. And then when it was done, he made sure the file found its way to the right people, so people who would build exactly the right weapon and aim it directly at me." She looked at the coffee cup on the counter. She looked at the frost on the grass beyond the window. She was aware, in a very cold and functional way, that she was processing something that should have broken her and that she was not breaking because she had been trained not to break, and because breaking was not currently an option. "He used my father," she said. "Your father's death, your grief, your capability." Cassian's voice was not gentle exactly, but it was stripped of the authority register entirely, leaving something quieter beneath it. "You were the weapon he built to remove me from power. You were never meant to actually hand me to the federal system. You were meant to get close enough to me that my elimination would look like an inside job," she said. He nodded once. She stood at the kitchen window with the frost on the glass, and her father's name rearranging itself in her memory into a different configuration. Not a death that had been revenged or prosecuted or grieved properly, but a death that had been systematically harvested, converted, weaponized, aimed. And she felt something move through her that was not grief and was not rage and was not anything she had a clean name for. "How long have you known all of this?" she said. "The broad shape of it, 6 weeks. The specifics?" He paused. "More recently. Since I arrived. Since before you arrived." He held her gaze. "I knew a planted operative was coming. I didn't know it was you specifically until the 2nd week." She absorbed this. "And you didn't have me removed," she said. "No." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, Tobias had stopped moving. The frost was beginning to lift as the thin November sun hit the grass, the crystals catching the light before they disappeared. "Because I wanted to understand who built the operation," Cassian said. "And because—" He stopped, started again. "You saved my life twice." That complicated the calculation. She looked at him. "That's a stupid reason," she said. Something that was almost, not quite, a fraction of a thing that lived adjacent to a smile crossed his face and was gone. "Yes," he said. "It is." Geeked. Varro found her 40 minutes later. She was making the beds in the second-floor guest rooms, not Morano's suite, which she'd already done, but the 2 smaller rooms adjacent. And he came in without knocking and stood in the doorway with the set of a man who has made a decision and is executing it. "I need you to come with me," he said. She smoothed the pillowcase. "Let me finish this room." "Now." She turned and looked at him. He had 2 men behind him in the corridor, both armed, both with the specific quality of readiness that meant they'd been told this might go a direction that required them. She set down the pillow. She went with them. They took her to the security office. Varro closed the door. The 2 men stayed inside, positioned at the door and the window, which was the configuration you used when you expected someone to try to leave quickly. Varro placed a photograph on the desk. She looked at it. It was her. Not in her housekeeper's uniform, but in outdoor gear. A surveillance photograph taken at distance, slightly grainy, showing her at what appeared to be a government facility entrance. The timestamp in the corner was 14 months ago. "This was pulled from a federal contractor's security archive," Varro said. "You want to tell me which agency?" She looked at the photograph. She looked at Varro. She thought about Cassian in the kitchen 20 minutes ago, the specifics of what he'd told her, the new shape of who had built this mission and why. She thought about Crow. She thought about the device in her bag and the 8 characters and the timeline that had been compressed not because the operation needed more urgency, but because Morano needed something concluded before Cassian could identify all the moving pieces. "I need to speak with Cassian," she said. "You're speaking with me." "I know." She kept her voice level. "I need to speak with Cassian." "That's not—" "What I'm about to tell you," she said, "is going to determine whether this estate survives the next 72 hours. It is above your clearance level, Varro. I'm not saying that as an insult. I'm saying it because you need to get him in this room before you make any other decisions about what to do with me." Varro looked at her for a long time. His jaw was tight. His hands were flat on the desk. She could see the calculation running behind his eyes. The specific professional humiliation of being told a problem was bigger than him by the person who was the problem. He picked up his radio. She waited. She stood in the security office with the 2 armed men at the walls and the photograph of herself on the desk, and she breathed carefully and let her mind run through everything she knew and everything she'd just been told and everything she still didn't know, which was considerable, which was the most dangerous part. She had come here to bring a man to justice for her father's death. She had found instead a man who had read her father's actual file and said his name like it mattered. She had been built into a weapon by the man who had murdered her father, and she had not known it, and the weapon was about to be used. And there was a specific window of time in which she could alter the trajectory of that use, or she would become complicit in something her father, the man in the photograph, the man with the easy grin, the man who had gone into dangerous places for reasons he believed in, would not have recognized as justice by any name. Cassian came through the door 4 minutes later. He looked at the photograph on the desk. He looked at Vero. He looked at Leora. "Leave us," he said to Vero. "Don, I don't think—" "Leave." Vero left. The two men left. The door closed. Cassian stood across the desk from her in the security office with the photograph of her 14 months younger between them, and he said nothing, waiting. And the way she'd come to understand was how he listened when he was listening seriously. She took a breath. "Murano has a secondary operation running parallel to yours," she said. "It's been in place for at least 2 years. He has a handler, someone in a position to run external agents, who has been coordinating intelligence designed to destabilize your organization from the inside while positioning an outside actor to remove you directly." She paused. "That actor is me." He was very still. "Crow," she said, "is not a federal task force handler. Or he is, but that's not what he primarily is. The task force was the mechanism. The mission was built by someone who needed a specific kind of leverage, someone with genuine motive and genuine capability who would get close enough to you to complete the job without it looking like what it was." "Murano," Cassian said. "Murano arranged my father's death. Then he arranged for the evidence of that death to reach a federal operation that would turn me into an instrument. Crow managed my training and placement. All of it points to a single orchestrating hand. You're telling me my consigliere of 30 years has been running an operation to have me killed using the daughter of a man he murdered?" He said it not with disbelief, but with the flat, exhausted register of a man recognizing the full dimensions of something he'd been dreading. "Yes. And you're telling me this now?" "Yes." "Why?" She held his gaze. "Because I came here to get justice for my father," she said. "Not to be the instrument of the man who killed him." The room was quiet. Somewhere outside, a vehicle had arrived at the rear gate. She could hear the crunch of gravel, the security exchange on the radio that Vero had left on the desk. She registered this in the background, the way she registered everything, while her full attention stayed on Cassian and on the very specific quality of what was happening in this room right now, which was two people standing across a desk from each other with the full weight of everything they were and everything they'd done between them, trying to decide whether any of it could be the basis for something. The radio on the desk crackled. Vero's voice came through sharp and clipped. "Don, we have a problem at the rear gate." Cassian didn't move his eyes from Leora's face. "How many?" he said toward the radio. "4 vehicles. They're not ours. They're not announcing." A pause of exactly 2 seconds in which Cassian and Leora looked at each other across the desk and the photograph and the full accumulated weight of everything that had just been said. And in that pause, she watched him make a calculation she recognized because she'd made versions of it herself. The calculation of a person deciding in real time whether to trust something that all their instincts said was dangerous, but that every available piece of evidence said was true. He picked up the radio. "Lock the rear gate. Get everyone inside. Nobody moves without my direct order." He set the radio down. He looked at her. "How long have we had?" "Since the transmission I didn't send last night," she said. "When I deviated from protocol, Crow would have flagged it. If he's coordinating with Murano in real time—" She stopped. "Hours. Maybe less. Murano left 6 hours ago. Then he made a call." Cassian moved around the desk. Not toward her, toward the door. But he stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back, and there was something in his face that she hadn't seen before, something that was not authority and not calculation and not the performance of either. Something raw and briefly unguarded. "Can you fight?" he said. She held his gaze. "Yes," she said. He held the door open. She went through it first. "Tikat." The estate had 7 entry points that she'd cataloged in the first week. Front gate, rear gate, 2 sections of the east fence with climbable approach angles, the service tunnel under the north lawn that she'd found on day 4, and that she was not supposed to know existed, the roof access from the east wing, and the basement delivery bay that connected to the underground parking. She ran through all 7 in her head as she moved with Cassian through the ground floor corridor. Fast. Not running, but close to it. While above them, the estate came to life with the specific organized urgency of a security apparatus responding to a threat. Boots on stone, radio traffic, doors. Varro met them at the junction of the main corridor and the security hall, 2 of his men behind him, his face carrying the specific flatness of someone who has shifted entirely out of the administrative register and into the operational one. He looked at Leora beside Cassian, and his mouth tightened, but he didn't say anything, because Cassian's presence beside her was a statement that superseded whatever Varro had been planning to do with her. "Rear gate is holding," Varro said, "but they're not trying the gate. East fence, north section. We have movement." "The approach angle," Leora said. Varro looked at her sharply. "There are 2 climbable sections on the east fence," she said. "North section has better cover from the tree line. If they came in 4 vehicles and they're not hitting the gate, they've split the approach. Some of them are already inside the perimeter." "How do you—" "Because I've been looking at this property for 5 weeks," she said. "Which room is the Dawn's most defensible interior position?" Varro's jaw worked. He looked at Cassian. Cassian said, "Answer her." "The study, 2nd floor, stone on 3 sides, 1 door, the window faces front, not rear." "Then that's where he needs to be." She looked at Cassian. "Not negotiable." I know you don't retreat," she said flatly. "I'm not asking you to retreat. I'm asking you to be in the room where you're hardest to kill while I figure out how many of them are already past the fence." Something passed between them that was not an argument and was not agreement, but was something that occupied the space between those things. A recognition, fast and wordless, of the specific situation they were in and what it required. He went with Varro. She went the other way. So, she pulled the fire extinguisher from the ground floor utility closet, heavy, red, solid metal casing, and carried it to the east corridor where the window looked out over the rear lawn and the section of fence she'd identified. She positioned herself to the side of the window frame, not in front of it, and looked out from the angle. She counted 3 shapes moving across the frost-whitened lawn. Fast, low, disciplined. Not opportunists. These were trained people moving in a formation she recognized. 2 advancing, 1 covering, cycling forward. The kind of movement pattern that got drilled until it was below the threshold of thought. She had no weapon. She had a fire extinguisher and the knowledge of the building's interior that she'd spent 5 weeks acquiring. She moved. The east corridor connected to the service passage on the north side through a door that the household staff used for laundry access, which she had a key for, which put her ahead of the advancing formation's likely entry point by approximately 40 feet in 20 seconds. She moved through the service passage in near darkness, one hand on the wall, counting doorways, reaching the end where the passage met the ground floor north anteroom, just as she heard the first window break somewhere behind her. They were in. She pressed herself against the wall of the anteroom and listened. Footsteps on the service passage floor. 1 set, moving carefully, which meant one of the 3 had split from the formation to clear this route, while the other 2 continued through the main ground floor. She could hear them, faintly, somewhere to her south. Boot soles on stone, deliberate, the specific rhythm of someone clearing rooms. She waited. The footsteps in the service passage slowed as they reached the darkness. A light came on, the small bright circle of a tactical flashlight sweeping the passage, and she saw the edge of it reach around the corner of the doorframe, moving in an arc, and she timed the arc's rotation, and when the light swept away, she stepped out from the anteroom and drove the base of the fire extinguisher into the side of the figure's head with both arms and everything she had behind it. The light went out. The figure went down. She took the weapon from the holster, compact, semi-automatic, one in the chamber, and moved on. Jishasin. The radio she'd taken off the downed man crackled as she moved back through the ground floor toward the main staircase. A voice she didn't recognize, speaking in clipped operational shorthand. position updates, clearing confirmations, and then a second voice that gave her one step before she registered what she was hearing, because the second voice was Crow. He was here, not directing from a distance, not on a secure channel in a facility 600 miles away. He was here, inside the estate or immediately outside it, running the operation in person, which meant this was not a sanctioned federal action. Federal actions did not use civilian contractors and non-standard entry and the specific unannounced aggression of 4 vehicles and a fence approach, which meant this was exactly what she'd spent the night concluding it was. She took the stairs 2 at a time. The second floor was louder. She could hear Vero's security at the south end, the short controlled exchanges of armed men holding a position, and from the study door the specific quality of silence that meant Cassian was behind it, and Vero's men were in front of it, and that configuration was currently holding. But the configuration was also 2 men against however many had come in those 4 vehicles. She came off the staircase into the second floor corridor and nearly ran into Brandt. He had a weapon out, and he brought it up, and she had hers up simultaneously, and they stood in the corridor 2 feet apart with guns leveled at each other, and his face was doing something she couldn't read. Not the face of a man who'd seen an intruder, but the face of a man who had made a decision earlier and was now meeting a complication. She clocked it in a fraction of a second. "You knew they were coming," she said. His jaw moved. "Put it down," he said. "You knew they were coming and you didn't tell Vero." "Put the weapon—" She shifted aim 2 degrees to the left and fired once into the wall beside him, and the sound in the enclosed stone corridor was enormous, and Brandt flinched. Not a defensive flinch, a guilty one, the flinch of a man whose nerve broke under pressure. And in that half-second she moved inside his reach and had his weapon and her elbow at his jaw in a sequence that put him down the same way she'd put the man in the front hallway down 5 weeks ago, fast and clean and without hesitation. She stood over him. She took his radio. She had 2 weapons now. Down the corridor, Vero's men had heard the shot and she could hear them coming, and she called out, loud, flat, with enough command in her voice to penetrate. "Friendly, North Corridor. 2 shooters have breached the east wing, 1 down. Brandt is compromised." A pause. Then Vero's voice, careful. "Say again." "Brandt knew they were coming. He's down. I'm coming to the study." Another pause, shorter. "Come slow," Vero said. She came slow, hands visible until she was close enough for them to read her face, and then she was through the study door and Cassian was against the far wall with the stone at his back and a weapon in his hand that he'd sourced from somewhere, and he looked at her when she came through the door. The specific look of a man who had spent 30 years never allowing himself to rely on anyone and who was in the process of doing exactly that, and who didn't know yet whether it would kill him. "Brandt," he said. "Down." He was with them. Cassian's face did something very brief and very dark. "How many inside?" he said. "At least 4 past the fence. 1 down in the service passage. Brandt down. 2 still clearing the ground floor at minimum." She looked at Vero. "The service tunnel under the north lawn, is it currently accessible from both ends?" Vero stared. "How do you know about the— Is it accessible?" "Yes. The exterior hatch is in the groundskeeper's shed. Then we have a rear exit if we need it." She looked at Cassian. "Crow is on site. He's running this personally." The room absorbed this. "Your handler," Cassian said. "He's not running a federal operation. This is Morano's endgame. Clean removal, chaos covers the mechanism, your organization fragments without you, Morano steps into the vacuum with his hands clean." She paused. "He's been building to this for years. We walked into the compression of the whole operation. A burst of gunfire from downstairs. Short, controlled, 2 exchanges. And then silence that had a different quality to it than the silence before." Vero went to the door and listened. His radio gave 3 bursts of static, then, "Ground floor is ours. 2 hostiles down. 1 escaped rear." Vero spoke into the radio. "Status on the east wing. Still clearing. How many total you're seeing?" A pause, then, 8, maybe 10. Vero turned and looked at Cassian. 10 people. Cassian had 4 loyal security left standing inside the estate, 2 at the study door, 2 on the ground floor. Leora with 2 weapons. Varro. The tunnel, Cassian said to Varro. Don, not for me. He looked at Leora. There's a secondary safe room in the north wing that connects to the tunnel. Renata and Tobias, they need to be moved. I'll do it, Leora said. You don't... I know where it is, she said. I found it in the second week. The panel behind the laundry alcove. She looked at him steadily. You stay in this room. This is not a discussion. His jaw was tight. His eyes were doing the thing they did, the reading thing, and what he was reading was the same thing he'd been reading for 5 weeks in corridors and kitchens and rear terraces, and she watched him reach the same answer he'd been reaching every time, the answer that kept defying the calculation. 2 minutes, he said. She was out the door. Pat. She moved through the second floor with 1 weapon up and the other in her waistband, and she was in the space that training created, the narrow corridor of pure operational focus, where everything extraneous fell away, and what remained was only movement and target and breathing, slow, controlled, in through the nose because panic lived in the mouth. The East Wing corridor was empty. She took the stairs to the ground floor. Renata was in the kitchen, pressed against the wall beneath the window ledge with Tobias beside her, both of them low, both of them silent, with the particular trained animal stillness of people who had survived inside this house by knowing when not to move. Renata looked up when Leora came in, and her face ran through 3 expressions in quick succession: relief, fear, and the particular hard focus of a woman who had survived 11 years in this house by paying attention. Can you walk? Leora said to Tobias. Yes. Then follow me, fast and quiet. Don't stop for anything. She took them through the service passage to the laundry alcove and hit the panel the way she'd cataloged it. 3 fingers on the lower left corner, pressure and slide, and the door released. She pushed them through and held the panel from the inside as she came through behind them and let it close. The safe room was small, stone-walled, with a cot and water and a radio with a single channel. She showed Tobias the radio. If you don't hear from Varro or Cassian in the next 30 minutes, use this. Frequency is preset. Say the word ground line and give your location. Someone will come. Tobias looked at her. Who are you? He said. Someone who should have answered that question differently 5 weeks ago. She looked at Renata. The tunnel exit is 40 feet north. Hatch inside the groundskeeper's shed. If you hear shooting close, you go. Don't wait. Renata grabbed her wrist. Don't get him killed, she said. Leora looked at her. She didn't say anything. She went back through the panel. She heard Crow before she saw him. She was moving back through the ground floor east corridor toward the main staircase when his voice came from the study anteroom. Not on the radio this time, live, 20 feet away, in the particular measured tone of a man who has entered a space he believes he controls. She stopped. She pressed against the wall. She heard Crow's voice, and she heard another voice answering it, and the other voice was Morano's, and both of them were inside the estate, past Varro's perimeter, which meant the second vehicle wave had come through a point none of them had been watching, which meant the service entrance on the west side that she had cataloged as low risk, because it required a code she hadn't expected Morano to still have. She moved to the anteroom doorway. Crow was exactly as she'd pictured him, middle 50s, lean, a face arranged into the permanent professional neutrality of someone who had been in the business of managing people toward bad ends for a very long time. He was wearing dark tactical gear, rather than the civilian business dress she'd always half imagined, and he was carrying a weapon, and beside him Morano stood in his good coat looking exactly like what he was. A man who had sent other people to do his work for so long that he had forgotten how to look at it directly. 2 of Crow's men were with them. She did the math. She had 2 weapons. She had the element of surprise for approximately the next 3 seconds, and then she would not have it. She stepped into the anteroom. Stop, she said. They turned. Crow looked at her with an expression she hadn't expected. Not surprise, not the recalculation of a blown cover, but something closer to satisfaction. Which was wrong. Which was immediately wrong, and she felt it in the base of her spine before she understood it. Leora, he said. Good. You're here. Put it down, she said. You're not going to shoot me. I will absolutely shoot you. No. He tilted his head slightly. You won't. Because if you do, the standing order I have with the two men currently holding the second-floor staircase gets executed. He paused. They have Viscari. The word landed like something physical. She held the weapon up. She held her breathing level. She held everything steady by force of the specific discipline she'd spent 3 years acquiring, and she did not let what was happening behind her eyes reach her face. You're lying, she said. Third step from the top, Crow said. There's a chip in the stone from a piece of furniture that was moved 3 years ago. Your man is on his knees at the top of those stairs, and there are 2 guns at the back of his head, and if I don't radio confirmation in the next 60 seconds that this room is clear, they execute him and walk out through the east wing. Morano had not said anything. He was watching her with the careful attention of a man who has engineered something from a distance and is now watching the mechanism complete its final movement, and the quality of that watching, detached, assessing, the complete absence of anything human in it, told her more than Crow's words had. This was the completion. This was what Morano had built her for. Not to gather evidence, not to facilitate a prosecution, but to be here, in this exact position, where the choice was between the weapon in her hand and the man at the top of the stairs. A weapon aimed at the man who ran her. A man aimed at the man she had spent 5 weeks circling the truth about. Crow said, "Put the weapon down and we all walk out of here." Morano said, "The Don retires, permanently. You come with us. The operation concludes." She looked at Crow. She looked at Morano. She thought about her father's photograph, face down on the nightstand. She thought about a man with an easy grin standing in good light, laughing at something outside the frame. She thought about the stone chip on the 3rd step from the top of the main staircase, which she knew was there, which she had noted in the first week, which was exactly where Crow had said it was. She lowered the weapon 2 inches. Crow's shoulders dropped a fraction, the involuntary release of a man whose bluff has been. She brought the weapon back up and fired. Not at Crow, at the radio on his belt. The shot was close range and precise, and the radio disintegrated and Crow lurched sideways from the impact's edge, and she was already moving. Not toward him, but past him, through the anteroom and into the main corridor, running hard for the staircase, because the 60-second window was now irrelevant, and the order to the men on the stairs would come by voice, or it would not come at all, and she had maybe 8 seconds before Crow recovered and understood what she'd done. She hit the staircase at full speed. She took the stairs 3 at a time with the weapon up and her eyes already on the top landing, and she saw them. 2 men, both armed, both turning toward the sound of her coming up, and between them on his knees with his hands at his sides, and his face carrying the specific controlled fury of a man who has been put on his knees and is still deciding exactly how he's going to respond to that, was Cassian. He saw her. She shot the man on the left in the shoulder and threw herself into the man on the right before he could bring his weapon level, driving him back into the wall. And the impact was brutal, all her weight and speed and the wall's resistance. And his weapon discharged into the ceiling, and she drove her knee up and her elbow down in the sequence that ended the fight. And then she was standing at the top of the stairs with both men down and her chest heaving, and Cassian was getting to his feet. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Radio," she said, breathing hard. "I destroyed Crows. They couldn't execute the order." He looked at the 2 men on the floor and back at her. "You figured that in the time it took you to raise the gun 2 inches and then bring it back up," he said. It was a long 2 inches. Something moved through his face, fast, unguarded, there and gone. From below, shouting. Crow's voice sharp and operational, directing his remaining men. Morano's voice underneath it, harder to read, the quality of a man recalculating. "How many does he have left?" Cassian said. 4 or 5. 2 of yours are down on the ground floor. Varro has 2 at the south end." She checked the weapon. 6 rounds remaining. "We need to move." "Where?" "Down," she said. "We end this down there." He picked up one of the fallen men's weapons without ceremony and checked the load the way a person checks something they've handled 10,000 times. And she had a single sharp moment of seeing him completely clearly. Not as the file, not as the composite she'd built, not as the man she'd been sent to destroy or the man she'd been used against, but as exactly what he was, a 52-year-old man with silver at his temples and a scarred jaw, who had built his life in a world that had required him to be harder than a person should have to be, and who was standing at the top of a staircase in his own house, ready to walk back down into it one more time. She went first. They came down the stairs fast and low, and the ground floor corridor was chaos. Two of Crow's men in the east hallway, one covering the main corridor junction, Varro's voice somewhere south calling positioning updates on his radio. The overhead lights were on, which was bad. They'd lost the darkness advantage. And the stone walls were throwing sound in every direction, making distance hard to read. Cassian moved behind her, and she felt the specific quality of having someone at her back who she trusted not to hesitate, which was not a feeling she'd had in a very long time, which she registered and set aside. The man at the corridor junction saw them first. He fired, and she was already moving sideways, pulling Cassian with her into the doorway of the formal dining room, and the shot cracked into the wall where they'd been standing and sent plaster down in a gray shower. She returned fire twice around the doorframe, covering shots not aimed, designed to push him back, and heard the specific sound of a body weight shifting behind cover. "East hallway," Cassian said, low, close to her ear. "If we let them hold that junction, they cut us off from Varro." "I know." She checked the angle. "I'm going to come out high right. When he shifts to track me, you take the left line." "That puts you in the open." "Yes." "Leora." "When he shifts," she said. 3 seconds. She went before he could argue. She came out of the doorway high and moving right, drawing the man's weapon track, and she heard Cassian's shot from behind her. One round, controlled, and the man at the junction went down. She was already past the junction and into the east corridor before the sound finished echoing. Two of Crow's men were at the far end. She took the first one with a shot that hit high on the chest and dropped him, and the second one tackled her. Full body weight, both of them going into the wall, the weapon knocked from her hand somewhere in the collision. She was smaller, and she used it, dropping her center of gravity and twisting and using his momentum to bring him over her hip. But he was trained, and he recovered fast, and they ended up on the corridor floor in the specific ugly intimacy of close quarters fighting, which was not technique and was not clean but was weight and leverage, and the willingness to absorb damage in order to deliver it. He hit her twice, once in the ribs and once on the side of the head, and both landed and both hurt, and she cataloged the hurt the way she'd been trained to and kept moving, because the moment you acknowledged pain as a reason to slow down was the moment you lost. And she drove the heel of her palm into his nose and felt the cartilage give, and the fight left him in the specific way it leaves a person when their eyes flood involuntarily and their body decides it has had enough. She got up. Her ribs screamed. She found the weapon, picked it up. Cassian was behind her. He looked at her face and then at the man on the floor. "You're hurt," he said. "I'm functional." She straightened. "Where's Crow?" A door opened at the end of the east corridor. Morano came through it. He was alone. She didn't know where Crow was, didn't know if Varro had him, didn't know if he'd retreated, and Morano was moving with the careful, measured pace of a man who had decided something and was walking toward it. He had a weapon in his hand, but it was at his side, not raised, which was the specific posture of a man who had decided the weapon was secondary. He stopped 20 feet away. He looked at Cassian. Cassian looked at him. The corridor was suddenly very quiet. 30 years, Cassian said. Morano's face was composed. 32. You built everything with me. I built everything, Morano said. You were the name on it. The words were not delivered with heat or bitterness. They were delivered as fact, in the flat tone of a long-held belief finally spoken aloud, which made them land harder than anger would have. Cassian's face was very still. Martin Ashcroft, he said. Morano's gaze moved to Leora for the first time. He looked at her the way you look at a result, not a person, a result, with the evaluating detachment of a man who built something and is assessing whether it performed to specification. He was a problem, Morano said. He was a father, Leora said. He was a federal agent who had built a case that would have taken this organization apart in 2019. His voice remained level. I made a decision. It was the correct decision for the organization. And then you made me, she said. You found his file. You found me. You built a weapon out of his death and pointed it at the man you decided you were done serving. Morano looked at her without blinking. "You're more than I expected," he said. It was not a compliment or an apology. It was the objective assessment of a craftsman examining a piece of work. Something ignited in her chest. Not rage, which was too hot, but something colder and more permanent. The specific feeling of being seen as an instrument by the person who built you into one. And she had to consciously close her hand around it and hold it. "Where is Crow?" she said. "Withdrawn." He said it without inflection. "When you destroyed the radio, I made a calculation. Crow's use to me was contingent on operational control. Without it, he becomes a liability." "You cut him loose," Cassian said. "I cut loose what I needed to cut loose." He looked at Cassian directly. "I've always done what the situation required. You know that." "I know," Cassian said. "I relied on it for 32 years. Morano raised the weapon. He raised it smoothly and without hurry and aimed it at Leora, not at Cassian, which Leora had half expected because Morano was a man who thought in leverage, and she was the leverage that had turned his instrument against him. And she was therefore the problem that needed solving first. She brought her own weapon up. They stood in the east corridor of the estate with weapons leveled at each other and Cassian 4 feet to her left. And Morano's face was the same composed professional mask it had always been. And she thought about her father standing in good light laughing at something outside the frame. And she thought about 3 years of grief converted into motion. And she thought about what justice actually meant when you were standing inside it. Morano fired. Cassian moved. He moved the way she'd moved on the staircase. Not away from it, but into it, into the line of the shot. And the bullet that had been aimed at her center mass hit him in the left side, and the impact spun him, and she felt the air change beside her as he went down to one knee. She fired twice. Both rounds hit Morano in the chest, and he went back against the corridor wall and slid down it, and the weapon fell from his hand, and the composed professional mask stayed on his face even as his body stopped cooperating. And she watched him look at Cassian, not at her, at Cassian, with an expression she could not fully read, which might have been regret and might have been something else entirely. And then he was still. The corridor was silent. She was already at Cassian's side. He was on one knee with one hand pressed against his left side, and his face carrying the controlled tightness of a person managing serious pain through discipline rather than absence of it. She went down beside him and moved his hand and looked. Entry wound, left flank, bleeding heavily. She needed to know if it had hit anything vital, and she didn't know and wouldn't know until someone who knew more than she did could look at it. "How bad?" he said. "I don't know yet." "That's a bad answer." "Yes." She took off her uniform overshirt and pressed it hard against the wound, and his breath went sharp through his teeth. "Hold that. Don't let go." "Leora, don't talk." She had her hand on top of his hand on the shirt, and she was looking at his face, and his face was gray under the corridor lights, and his eyes were sharp, still sharp, fully present, which was the thing she was tracking. "Varro," she called. "Varro!" Footsteps from the south corridor. Fast, multiple, and Varro came around the junction with 2 of his men and stopped when he saw the corridor. He saw Morano against the wall. He saw Cassian on the floor. His face ran through several things in very quick succession and came out the other side at something that was purely functional. "Get a car," she said. "Hospital. Now." "There's a doctor on—" "Hospital." She held Varro's eyes. "This is beyond an estate doctor. Get a car." Varro got a car. The hospital was 40 minutes away on roads that were still frost-slicked at the edges, and she sat in the back seat with Cassian's head tilted against the door and her hands maintaining pressure on the wound through the shirt that was already soaked through, and she talked to him. Not significantly. Not about anything that mattered in the way that dying people in movies talk to each other. She talked to him the way you talk to someone to keep them present. About the road, about the frost on the fields outside the window, about the fact that Tobias's back had apparently been bothering him since an old landscaping injury, and she'd noticed him compensating for it every morning for 5 weeks, which she'd been meaning to mention. She talked to keep his eyes open and his breathing steady, and because the alternative to talking was silence, and silence had a weight she wasn't willing to let into the car. He listened. Once he said, "You're keeping me awake." Yes, it's working. I know, she said. Don't thank me yet. His mouth moved into something that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same geography. She kept talking. The surgery took 4 hours. She sat in the hospital corridor on a plastic chair with dried blood on her hands and her ribs aching in a way that indicated at least one of them was cracked. And she did not move and did not pace and did not do any of the things that people do when they're waiting because she had already expended everything she had, and what was left was just the waiting itself, which she was going to have to sit inside until it ended. Varro sat down beside her at the 2-hour mark. He didn't say anything immediately. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands together and looked at the floor, and she looked at the floor too, and they occupied the corridor in the specific shared silence of two people who have been on opposite sides of something and have arrived, through a route neither of them planned, at the same place. "Brand is alive," he said finally. "I know. I didn't hit him hard enough to do permanent damage. He's talking." A pause. "Says Morano approached him 8 months ago. Money, and a guarantee that he'd survive whatever came next." He was quiet for a moment. "He says Morano told him the Don had 6 months before the organization collapsed anyway, that he was doing him a mercy." She looked at her hands. "Morano told a lot of people things that were shaped to be believed," she said. "Were they true? About the organization collapsing?" She thought about it honestly. Parts of it. The organization was under real pressure. Morano made sure of it. But Cassian wasn't the weakness. Morano spent years making him look like the weakness to anyone who would listen. Varro was quiet. "You knew who you were," he said. "From the beginning." "Yes." "And you stayed." She looked up at the ceiling, at the flat institutional light of the corridor. "I stayed because I thought I understood what I was doing," she said. "And then I stayed because the thing I thought I understood turned out to be something different. And then I stayed because—" She stopped. Varro didn't push it. They sat in the corridor for another 2 hours until the doctor came out. He was in a room on the 3rd floor by the time they let her in, a private room that Varro had arranged with the specific quiet efficiency of someone who had handled a great many things that required discretion. And the room was dim and smelled of antiseptic and the particular institutional neutrality of a place designed to hold recovery without comment. Cassian was awake. He looked reduced by the hospital context, the gown, the IV line, the monitors with their steady, indifferent reporting, in the way that physical authority always looks reduced when the body that carries it has been reminded of its own fragility. But his eyes were sharp, and his color was better than it had been in the car, and when she came through the door, he tracked her immediately. She sat in the chair beside the bed. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "Morano," he said. "Gone." He absorbed this. His face did something brief and private. "Crow," she said. "Varro's people are looking. He withdrew when the operation failed. Morano said as much. He'll surface eventually. There will be a federal investigation when he does." She paused. "There will be investigations regardless." "I know. They'll want testimony." "I know that too." He looked at her directly. "And you? What does the task force do with you now?" She had been thinking about this for 4 hours in the corridor. "I don't know yet," she said. "The task force was partially Morano's construction. How much of Crow's operation was legitimate federal work, and how much was his own arrangement? That's going to take time to untangle." She looked at her hands. "I was a sanctioned operative. I didn't complete the original mission as stated. I'll have to answer for that." "You stopped the man who killed your father." "I stopped him from killing someone else," she said. "That's not the same thing." He looked at her for a long moment. "What do you want?" he said. Not as a practical question, as the other kind. She was quiet. She thought about what she'd wanted for 3 years, the clean, specific shape of it, the narrative she'd built around her father's death, the story in which grief resolved into action, and action resolved into justice, and justice resolved into something you could finally put down. She thought about how that story had been constructed for her, shaped for her, aimed for her by a man who had murdered her father and then harvested the murder, and how even knowing that didn't make the grief less real or the loss less permanent or the 3 years less spent? She thought about sitting in this chair and the man in the bed and the 40-minute drive through frost-edged roads. I don't know yet, she said. That's the first honest answer I've given to that question. He looked at the ceiling. I built an organization on fear, he said. I told myself it was discipline, that it was the only language the world I was in understood. A pause. Morano understood it. He built everything he needed inside of it. I gave him 32 years of infrastructure to work with. He was quiet for a moment. I've been trying to decide what that makes me responsible for. Everything inside your own decisions, she said. Not the things he did inside the cover of your name without your knowledge. That's a generous accounting. It's an accurate one. Generous would be pretending the decisions you did make were clean. He looked at her. You're not going to let me off anything, he said. No, she said, but I'm not going to hold you responsible for what you didn't do either. That's not justice. That's just adding to the pile. The monitor beeped its steady, indifferent rhythm. My father would have said something like that, she said, more quietly. He believed in the actual thing, not the performance of it. She looked at the window, dark outside now, the reflection of the room's dim light in the glass. He went into dangerous places because he thought the actual thing was worth the risk. Not the system. The thing the system was supposed to be in service of. She hadn't said this out loud before. Not to anyone. Cassian didn't say anything, which was the right response, and she was aware of being grateful for it. The photograph on your nightstand, he said, after a moment. Yes. I thought about it, after I read the file. He looked at the ceiling again. A man I'd never seen, in a photograph I'd never seen, and I thought about it for 2 months. He paused. That's not adequate. I know that. It's not nothing either, she said. The room held that. Outside the window, the night was complete and cold, and the city beyond the hospital moved in its ordinary patterns. Lights, traffic, the ongoing indifferent business of the world that continued regardless of what happened inside individual rooms. She sat with it for a while. But 3 weeks later, in an unremarkable office on the 14th floor of a federal building downtown, she gave testimony for 6 hours. She gave it completely and without omission. Her recruitment, her training, her placement, every transmission she'd made and every one she hadn't, the reference code, the courier logs, Crow's on-site presence, Morano's constructed timeline, all of it. She gave it in the flat, precise language of a trained operative providing a debrief, because that was what it was, and because the actual thing was worth doing correctly, even when doing it correctly was exhausting. The investigator across the table was a woman in her 40s named Pell, who had the specific quality of attention of someone who has heard a great many accounts of a great many things and has learned to distinguish between the ones that are being shaped and the ones that are being delivered. She listened without interrupting. When Lyora finished, Pell asked 3 follow-up questions, all of them precise, all of them going to the specific points that needed confirmation. When it was done, Pell looked at her across the table. Crow, she said, we have him. He surfaced in Montreal 2 days ago. He's talking. A pause. He's trying to characterize the operation as fully sanctioned. He won't succeed. I know. You're not going to face charges for what happened at the estate. She nodded. The task force is being restructured, Pell said. Some of what Crow built was legitimate. Some of it was his own arrangement running parallel. Untangling it is going to take time. She looked at Lyora steadily. Your file is being closed. The identity you came in under is being retired. You'll need a new one. A slight pause. Or you could use your own. Lyora sat with that. Her own name. Her actual name. Not the operational construction, not Lyora Ashcroft the housekeeper, not the cover, and not the mission. The name her father had given her, which she had been carrying in the back of everything for 3 years, like something too important to take out in the open, where it might get damaged. I'll think about it, she said. Pell nodded. Take your time. Cassian dissolved the council 6 weeks after the estate. He did it quietly, in a series of individual meetings with the remaining family heads that Vero facilitated, and the terms were specific. The financial networks would be surrendered in a form that allowed investigators to dismantle them without triggering the street-level chaos that would have followed a sudden power collapse. The surviving lieutenants would cooperate with the restructuring. No one would come after Varro's people or anyone who had stayed loyal. She heard about this secondhand because she was not at the estate anymore. She was in a rented apartment 4 miles from the hospital, a second-floor place with tall windows that got morning light and a kitchen that smelled of old coffee and clean wood. And she was, for the first time in 3 years, not operationally tasked with anything. This was stranger than she'd expected. She filled the days with small, deliberate things. She bought a coffee maker and learned how to use it properly, not from a kettle, but with ground beans and the specific ritual of a process that produced something worth tasting. She ran in the mornings, not as training, but because the physical motion was one of the ways she'd always processed thought. And there was a great deal of thought currently requiring processing. She found a library 3 blocks away and went there in the afternoons and read without purpose, which was something she hadn't done since she was 17. She thought about her father. She thought about him differently now, not as an absence with a specific cause that required a specific response, but as a person. She thought about the easy grin and the way the light had been that day and what he'd been laughing at. She thought about his actual work, not the death of it, not the end, but the years of it, the thing he'd believed in and gone into difficult places to serve. She thought about what he'd wanted to leave in the world and what he'd actually left, which included her, which included the version of her that had emerged from everything that had come after, which was not the version he'd built, but was built from what he'd given her. She took the photograph out of the canvas bag. She placed it face up on the windowsill in the morning light. She looked at it for a long time. Then she got her coffee and stood at the window with it and looked at the street below and did not look away. Cassian came to find her on a Thursday in January, 2 months after the estate. He looked better than he had in the hospital, but the surgery had left something in his movement, a slight careful management of the left side that she noticed immediately because she noticed everything and because she knew exactly where the bullet had gone. He was in civilian clothes, which she'd only seen him in once before, in the kitchen at midnight with cold chicken and a leather notebook. And without the suit and without the estate around him, he looked, not smaller but more accurately sized, a man rather than an institution. She let him in. He looked at the apartment, the tall windows, the coffee maker, the photograph on the windowsill, and he didn't say anything immediately, which was still his way when he had something specific to say and was deciding how to begin it. She poured him coffee. He sat at the kitchen table. "The estate is being transferred," he said. "To what?" "A foundation. Youth services specifically. There's a woman named Pell who helped structure it." He held the coffee cup. "Children whose lives were adjacent to what the organization was, whose situations were made worse by the proximity." He paused. It seemed like the correct use. She thought about the stone walls and the iron fence and the gravel drive where she'd arrived in October with one bag and a face that gave nothing away. "It was a fortress," she said. "It was." He looked at the window. "It can be something else." She sat down across from him. "What are you doing?" she said. "Not what are you doing with the foundation." The other question. He held her gaze. "I don't know yet," he said. "I'm trying to figure out what a person does when they've spent 30 years building something that needed to come apart." He looked at the coffee cup. "I have money that was legitimate, properties, a construction company I actually ran, some investments that were clean. I have skills that are mostly relevant to things I'm not doing anymore." He paused. "I have a lot of time I don't know what to do with." "That sounds familiar," she said. "I thought it might." The morning light was coming through the tall windows and falling across the kitchen table between them, and outside the street was doing its ordinary business, and the photograph on the windowsill caught the light at an angle that made her father's face visible from where she was sitting. She looked at it. "He would have hated you," she said. Cassian followed her gaze to the photograph. "I know," he said. "He would have hated what you built, what it did, the proximity of it." She paused. "And then he would have spent time trying to understand it anyway, because that's what he did. He went into the difficult thing and tried to understand it from the inside. She looked at Cassian. He thought that was the only way to know anything real. He was right. He was also difficult and stubborn, and he burned dinner every time he made it, and he called me every Sunday whether I wanted him to or not. She looked at her hands. I'd give a lot for a Sunday phone call that burned dinner. The kitchen was quiet. I'm sorry, Cassian said. Not for a specific thing, not as a legal statement, not as a performance of accountability. Just 2 words in the flat, honest register she'd come to associate with the moments when he meant something completely. She looked at him. I know, she said. They sat with that for a while. Outside, someone was walking a dog on the street below, the dog stopping at every 3rd square of pavement to investigate something invisible and apparently compelling. The ordinary, specific texture of a January morning in a city that did not know or care what had happened in an estate 3 miles outside it, in a corridor, in a hospital room, in 6 hours of testimony, in all the accumulated weight of 3 years and a father's photograph and a mission that had turned inside out. I'm going to use my actual name, she said. Cassian looked at her. Leora, she said. It was always my name. The cover used it because it was already mine. She paused. The last name is different, but I'm keeping Leora. He nodded once. Leora, he said, as if he were confirming something he'd known for a while and was only now filing in the right place. She picked up her coffee. He picked up his. Outside the window, the dog had apparently resolved whatever question had occupied it at the 3rd pavement square and was moving on. And the morning light was shifting as the sun moved, and the photograph on the windowsill caught it differently now. Not her father's face at full visibility, but the shape of him, the outline, the suggestion of a man who had stood in good light once and laughed at something outside the frame. She did not look away from it. Neither did Cassian. They sat in the kitchen in the January light with the distance between them that had been built from everything they were and everything they'd done, and everything they'd nearly destroyed in each other. And with the knowledge, not yet acted on, but present in the room, the way weather is present before it arrives, that the distance could be a different thing than it had been if they chose to make it so. Not erased, not pretended away, but crossed, deliberately, with full understanding of the cost and the complication and the absolute absence of any guarantee. She had come to that estate in October with a mission and a grief and a face that gave nothing away, and she was leaving it, was already leaving it, had been leaving it since the moment she'd heard her father's name spoken by a man who'd read the actual file, with something she didn't have a clean name for yet. She was 23 years old. She had no family. She had a photograph in morning light, and a coffee maker she'd learned to use correctly, and a library 3 blocks away, and a man sitting across a kitchen table who had spent 30 years building something that needed to come apart, and who was, for the first time, sitting in the space that came after without yet knowing what to do with it. Neither did she. That, she thought, was perhaps the closest thing to a beginning she was going to get. She drank her coffee. Outside, January moved through its ordinary business, cold and bright and entirely indifferent, the way the world moves through everything, the terrible and the salvaged alike, with the same continuous forward motion that eventually carries even the heaviest things towards some version of whatever comes next.